And what I've done is I've created a file that contains links to the data sets that we're going to look at to make this a little bit easier in terms of opening up these files. And I can share this file with you after the webinar. Sorry I didn't send it out beforehand. That probably would have been useful to see some of these links, but these aren't too difficult. Again, the Johns Hopkins, World Health Organization, and the European Data Center are all data sets that we're going to look at. But before we do that, I just wanted to start actually by looking at a bit of a simpler data set. And let me see if I can get this onto the screen. This is a screenshot, or this is a website of the COVID data in Iceland. And I thought this would be a good one to start with just because, again, it's just for one country. It's simpler in terms of us being able to visualize this. This is their online site, which is called covid.is. If you search on that, so covid.is will bring you to this site. And let's see here. I just want to make sure, again, keep my chat window open. And make sure everyone can hear me. If anything happens and you're not able to hear me or see me, definitely put that up on the Q&A. Okay, so here's a graph that's on their webpage where they're showing the number of active infections and the number recovered. And Iceland has been doing a really, really great job of monitoring COVID and plotting out both the recovered individuals and the total infections. So here you can see again, the total infections and the number of recovered, and the active infections are in blue. And the number here is very, very low in terms of the current active infections. So if I wanted to download this data into DataGraph, there's a link here for downloading this. And I think that downloaded this file. There it goes. Now I have this CSV file. This is just called sheet1.csv. And I have my copy of DataGraph set up so that when I click on a CSV file, it will open them natively within DataGraph. So I'm just going to click on this file. Oh, actually, I guess I need to double click it. It did the preview. And there, this opened up on my other screen. Okay, so here is this data set where I have 3 columns of data. The first column represents the date, and the next column shows me the active infections, and the column after that shows me the recovered. Now, a couple of things when you're bringing the data into DataGraph from other sources, you need to be aware of what column format the data gets imported as. And for example, here, if you look at these 3 columns, they've been imported. The first 2, actually maybe the easiest way to see is going over to the column list. The first 2 have been imported as numeric columns, and the last one is imported as a text column. You can tell that because of the little AB icon, but these are numeric values. DataGraph has a lot of logic built in to try and make sure that it imports the right data or converts things to the correct data format. But here, because I think of all these blank rows, it got interpreted as text, even though we don't want that. So I can easily convert this to a numeric column type. I can click on the gear menu to convert to number, or you can also just click on the column header itself and convert that to a numeric column. Easy enough. The date is interesting because if you haven't worked with a lot of date columns within DataGraph, then dates are really flexible in terms of the way that you can, the program's ability to interpret dates in different format, maybe is the better way to put that. So here's a date column that's in sort of a different format. We're not showing the year because they don't at this point need the year in this. but it didn't get imported as a date. Again, it got imported as a number. So first thing would be just to, again, I can click on that, convert it to a date column. And it's a little confused because this is a non-standard format. It doesn't have this format built in. And so I can go under the gear menu and get some options for what this format might be. None of these quite work, but no problem. I can go into my date field and I can change this to an ICU format. And then I can type in what the format string is for this date. And I know this is a little bit maybe might seem advanced. I don't, I know we have people on the call that have different levels of comfort with using DataGraph. But an ICU format is basically a code for letting the program know what the date format is for the data that I'm looking at. So here I could just change this, and I'm hovering over the format field to show me a list of the text string that I would type in for this date to be read properly. So for example, here I could type in month, for month, .dd for day, and now my format is working correctly, except for the fact that it doesn't know what year this is. So if I go to copy this for a fixed year, sorry, maybe this is ICU day. There we go. This is the one that I wanted. Now here I'm going to give it the actual year that I'm importing. Oh, and I think I have this, sorry, day.month. That works better. But I'm still getting a red field here. And the reason is because the way dates work within DataGraph, actually the standard ICU date format, is there's a number underlying every day. And here this is saying 1970, which in 1970, there is no 29th of February, which is why that one day is giving me a red color, because it's not read properly. So I can change my year to 2020 and the dates are read correctly. So sorry, I mixed up my month and day field there. But I guess the point of this is to show you that a lot of these different data sets have the dates set up in different ways. And what we try and do in DataGraph in a variety of ways is to make it so that you don't have to change the data for it to be read properly. And dates are definitely one of those, an example of that. We have this functionality in here so that if this data changes, I have this column set up correctly and I won't need to reset up how the date fields are read. But again, I don't have to change the date field as Iceland provided me this data. I can use it exactly in the way that they've provided the data in order to plot my data. Okay, so now let's actually just do that. And I'm going to use a bars command initially to do that, where if I click on my active infections, and actually let me do it like this, recovered. This will give me a side-by-side bar graph of the data. And the issue here is that the bars command, just to teach you a little bit about how these different things work, the bars command doesn't natively work with dates, and instead we'll plot this based on an actual, the number within the row. So in fact, if you want to just plot the data where you're using a date in the x-axis, we're not going to use the side-by-side bars command here. Instead, I'm going to use another command that's under the command menu, and this is the bar command. So go ahead and add the bar command, and the value I want to plot is active infections. You can see those here. I can turn the hover on. Shift Command H allows me to hover over these bars to see the values associated with them. And I want the where, this is basically the same as the x-axis, to be my date field. So I can drag that and drop that. Now you see that the x-axis has a date field associated with it. So I can see my date values different than, again, on the bar graph here, where it's just showing the row number. It's not really, it doesn't understand dates in the way that this command does. So again, just teaching you a little bit more about how these different commands work. Here's my bar command. There is a section within the knowledge base that talks about creating bar graphs that really goes into more detail on the difference between these two commands. And the main issue here is that the ability to use a numeric axis, as you see here. I think it's explained well on the knowledge base, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but just so you understand that getting dates, having the date shown properly is something that we would use this other command for, rather than the side-by-side bar graphs that you have here. Okay, so one of the other things that I want to show you is I want to show you how we would use the pivot command, because that's the command that really allows us to do more processing of the data. The first two graphs that you see here, this one using a bars command, this one using a bar command, these are both commands that are used for displaying values that are in my data table. Whereas the pivot command not only can display the data, but it can also perform calculations of the data. Now, in order to use the pivot command, we want to have data that's in what we would refer to as a long format. And if you're familiar with DataGraph and you've used it for a while, you've probably encountered the suggestion of flattening your data. And this is exactly what we're going to do here. So the format that you have currently for this data, we have date in a single column, which is great. But then we have active infections and recovered in two separate columns. But this is data that we want to include both columns in this pivoting in this one graph. So what I would do is I would do a flattening operation on this data. This is only two columns, so it's not that wide, but as we look at some of these other data sets, you'll see that some of them, particularly Johns Hopkins data is the one where they have a very wide format. The table itself has many, many columns associated with it. In any case, just to give you a simple example, first, what I often do before doing this type of data flattening is just make a copy of the data, because it will change the format for that actual data. So this is the one circumstance where we do, and many times recommend changing the format you have. First thing I'm going to do is group this data. So here's what I downloaded. It's my one data set. And now I'm going to make a copy of it. One of my favorite ways, easy ways to copy things is to create this group, highlight it, and click and drag, but then hold down the Option key. You'll see that plus green symbol when you Option drag. That means I've just made a copy. This is the one that I'm going to flatten. Now let's just look at this data. And to do this, I'm going to highlight my two columns, go to Data, Flatten Columns. And what's happened is that now I still have three columns, but all my numeric values are in this one column that you see here. And the category associated with these is in a third column. So now to pivot this and use, again, this pivot command that we use for this data, I can then highlight my three columns where the first one is going to stay as a row identifier, be in one of the rows in my pivoted data. The second column I highlight is going to become a column heading, and the third one is a value, which again may seem sort of strange because we undid that. But with all the data in one column, it makes it a lot easier to explore this data in a variety of ways using the pivot command. So I'm going to click on the pivot command now. And what you'll see when you initially create a pivot command is by default, when I have a date field as for my rows, it's going to group it by year. I can expand the pivot command and I have a lot more options underneath. So if you look at this, again, my row setting is for the date, and then this entry for map rows is set to years, but I can easily change that. And I have a lot of options for how I can do that. I could change it to quarterly data. I can change it to monthly data. I can change it to weekly data. And if I like, I can also change this to daily data. One of the things here I'd probably want to do is to stack this instead of the side-by-side bars. We can go ahead and stack these columns one on top of another. Leaving this daily, I tend to like to take away the line in between them because it looks a little bit cleaner. And one of the things that you'll notice is that on the x-axis, I actually make this font maybe a little bit bigger. Make this bigger here. So hopefully you can see this well. That on the x-axis, this doesn't look very good, right? We have all our values are kind of garbled up together on the x-axis. And the reason for this has to do with how the x-axis is being interpreted. So this is also connected to what I was talking about earlier with the bars command, whether or not the axis is understood numerically or whether DataGraph is assuming that you're plotting different categories of data. By default, the pivot command is set to be based on categories. Now, this is something in the future I think I'm thinking about we might want to change when you're using dates. For it to be categorical doesn't necessarily make sense for a lot of data, particularly when you have data like this. But if you just uncheck this category button, now you'll see date fields associated with the x-axis. If I have a small amount of data, let me just zoom in on some data, and it's categorical, that does not want to work. Not sure why that zoom didn't work. I think because it's only showing the beginning of the data. Yeah, so here you can see this is categories. I don't know, it's not letting me toggle in between them for the Zoom. I'll have to check to see what's going on with that. But when you have categorical access, you can see how the tick marks are in between them. Again, we explain this a bit more in the knowledge base. So if you want more detail on that, I can recommend that page. But let me zoom this back out in both directions to get my full data set. And in any case, this gives me a reasonable looking graph. I can see my dates on the x-axis. If you reduce the font, then I can see the dates grouped according to week would be what I see here. If I reduce them more, then you'll see more and more numbers at some point. Actually, at this point, I'm not going down to individual values, but the increment here of where you're seeing the tick mark is weeks in between each of those values. Okay, so we've done this simple example where we're looking at this data, and we've talked about flattening data, and we've talked about pivoting data, and the fact that the pivot will let me very easily change the time increment that I'm using to group the data. So, and here, just to point out, again, if you're not familiar with this, I'm doing a calculation on these values right now, and it's summing the data within those date regions. Okay, so now let's get into some of the other data sets that are a little bit more complicated than this one. And I just want to check and see, again, let me check the chat and make sure that everyone is still with me. And okay, great. So, and if anyone has any questions at this point, feel free to go ahead and pose those. What I'm going to do now is go over to this file that has these links, and we'll start with the Johns Hopkins data set. In this file, I have a group where I've put a note field. This is where you add the note fields within DataGraph. And you can actually put HTML links within DataGraph, so it makes it easy to go back to particular websites that you're interested in. So here, for example, they have this Coronavirus Resource Center. They have their data in a GitHub repository, and they have links to various files that are in a comma-separated format, this CSV format. If I go to, I've already gone to these pages, so I set this up. So this is their GitHub page where they show you where their data is located. And if I go to one of their raw repositories where they have this data, you can see that this is just a jumble of numbers. This doesn't necessarily mean much. To bring this into DataGraph, this is actually one of the CSV files that they have. The easiest way to do this, if you either download the CSV, but if you just go to this website, you click on this link that's provided in that file, you can do Command A to select everything that's within this website, and then go, two steps. Command A to select all, Command C to copy everything into the clipboard. Now when I go back to DataGraph, I can Command V, and I just imported all that data. Notice now this is formatted into nice columns. On the web page, you can't really see the structure based on the comma-separated data, but now that I brought it into DataGraph, I can see that structure, and I have all these different columns where each column here is in fact a day's worth of data. And what they've been doing over time is every day they add a new column to this table, and as a result, they're making this a very, very wide column. So I go all the way to the right, and I can see this data is up to date up to the 14th. Okay, so as this data is right now, this would be sort of difficult for me to do much in terms of plotting and analyzing this data. The first thing would be that I need column titles just to make this something that's better organized. I can do that very easily with data that I bring in. If you have a row of data that you want to set to column titles, you can click on that row, right-click on the row, and there's an option for use row for column titles. So that's easy enough to do that. Now that I've done that, I can delete that row, and I'm deleting just the data currently that's visible that I have being shown. So I'll go ahead and say, yes, only visible data. Now I have titles on all of these, but this is data again where we would want to flatten this data set, because the dates themselves are in the column headers. We want to be able to use the dates to use as our x-axis or to aggregate our data. So again, I'm going to flatten this entire data set. I can highlight the first column, scroll all the way to the right, hold down the Shift key, highlight the last column, go back under data, say flatten columns. And now I have this very long data set, right? In fact, this comes out right now to 30,000 rows of data. That's not a problem actually at all for DataGraph to handle. So we can have these very long very long tables, and you will be able to analyze that in DataGraph without any problem. One of the things I would do here is, again, probably go ahead and group this data. Since the way I pasted it in, it didn't create a group natively. I'm going to highlight my columns, click group. So this is my Johns Hopkins data. And now that it's in a group, you can see there's a background color. So this data set, the one that I brought in here, this is actually just the cases data. They have separate CSV files for cases, deaths, and recovered. So just to look at this for a little bit, we have a designation of province or state, we have country and region, and we have latitude and longitude. Now that we've flattened this, the date column gets this name of category. We're going to change that to date. And so I don't need to capitalize that. And again, we want this to be a date field to be interpreted as a date. DataGraph is showing it as a text value. If I right click that, convert to date, this is a very standard format, so there's no additional date formatting I need to do here. It's interpreted the date correctly in this case. I have my value column here, which now again is this one big value. But now I have data for all these countries. And again, for some countries, the country data is divided by different provinces or states, but not for all. Now, with this data, if I wanted to just get a sense of worldwide what things looked like, again, using the pivot command is how I would do this. To make this easy, I can bring the date over to the left side. I have my country and my value that I would then, I can highlight all three of these, click on my pivot command, and again, I have some additional formatting I'm going to do. I don't want this as side by side because I have all these different countries. I'm going to stack this data. By default, again, this is 1 year of it's grouping it right now, summing everything across all my countries. I would want to change this to use an increment of time that made more sense. So if I wanted to do this over weeks, for example, I can see the data that I have associated with this particular data set, uncheck categories. Now I have a date, dates represented more appropriately on my x-axis, and oops. So what here, it's always good to see when something goes wrong, right? So I went to open up my screen wider, but I actually clicked on a row and moved it to the side, which is a way to move data on a row by row basis. I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to cancel out of that window and go back and open this up more. So now I can see this data a little bit better. Now, one of the things that DataGraph also will allow you to do is it will allow you to sort the data that you have pivoted. So here, if by default, the columns are in the order, in basically alphabetical order. And if I want to sort these, I can go into this menu next to the map columns and change it in terms of either increasing or decreasing. So there's a lot of countries, obviously, that are represented. This is worldwide. So this is really maybe not for presentation purposes, though certainly you could use it, but for exploration, this is very helpful. So I can go through and see from the countries that have the smallest number, and if I have my hover on, I can look through this to see the countries that have the most cases at this point. Maybe zoom this up. So you will change, again, that x-axis when you zoom the font. One of the things that we've been talking about modifying was to not lose those individual dates so quickly when you start zooming in, to have them remain a little bit longer. In any case, so there's a pivoted data set where you can see the total cases and you can see it by time. Now let me go to the next data that I have in this list, because again, I want you to see all these different formats and how we would handle them differently. And now I have this link for the World Health Organization in this file. This is COVID-19.who.int if you want to go to this site. And in my links here that I've already set up. This brings you to a coronavirus dashboard where I can see all of these cases represented on a map. And to download this data, you would click on this download map data link over in the bottom right, and that downloads a file. I already downloaded the file here, World Health Organization COVID-19 Global Data CSV. I want to bring this data into my DataGraph file, and I can do this by just taking my CSV and dragging and dropping it over onto my column list. So now I have a new set of data that I've imported, and the World Health Organization data is in many ways organized in a better way for how DataGraph works in terms of the fact that it's already a flattened data set. It's already this very long data where we have country codes, we have country names, we have regions, and all the data is in one table in terms of, at least in terms of deaths and cumulative deaths and confirmed cases and cumulative cases. So that's already all in here. And this makes it a lot easier because we don't have to do any of that flattening that we did before. We do still have to change our day into a date column, but that's done pretty easily. And this is now 15,000 rows of data. Again, this is no problem for DataGraph to handle this. And just checking our time here. So I'm going to go ahead and make another graph with this one. And again, I can highlight my day column. You don't have to move the columns next to each other. You can hold down the Command key to select columns that are not contiguous with one another. So I've selected the day, I selected the country name. I can now go to select these other columns if I would like, and again, make a pivot of that. Now, one thing is that I've already created a pivot command that has the formatting in the way I would like. I don't want to necessarily have to do that every single time that I create a new pivot command. So I can go back to my graph that I created here, and why not reuse this for my data from the World Health Organization. Actually, I'm going to put, just to keep track here, I can put a label. This will be my show graph. And so to do that, again, instead of starting from scratch, let's go back to the Johns Hopkins data and take this pivot command, and I'm going to actually drag it and drop it right on the thumbnail for this graph. And now I want to replace the data from Johns Hopkins with my data from the World Health Organization. Now, one thing that's handy is if my columns had the same exact names, meaning it was the date in this group was called date, what I wanted to plot value was, I had a value field, country, region. I could in that case actually drag this new group and drop it right on the command, but that's not what I have here. I have different names. Rather than change them, I'm just going to go ahead and click on my column headers and drag them and drop them onto the appropriate setting. This is going to look a little strange initially. Country name and the value that I would want to plot here. So now we have our data is updated to show the data from the World Health Organization. If I want to show this in terms of deaths or cases, I get that information that you see here. And I'm trying to think of anything else on this one. So I wanted you to realize that the commands themselves, as you create them, can be copy and pasted. I can clone my individual graphs. So if you go over to a thumbnail, I can click on this little icon here, and that makes a copy of a graphic that I've already created. So then I can do different, different actions on that. But in any case, the commands themselves, as you create them, you don't have to remake the command every single time. I can go ahead and use that command over and over again once I have set it up properly. So in this one, I could then say days to show more information. Again, maybe I want to not show the line. But then we have a lot of, again, there's a lot of data in here, a lot of countries, but if I hover over this, I can explore that data. Okay, now let's go to showing you the last data set, or the last source of data. Close the World Health Organization. And this is data from the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. Again, I have the link here. I'll go ahead and go to the website that has this. They have a nice website that, download today's data, and there are 3 different formats that they have data available in. They have a CSV data set, which is the type of data we've been looking at so far. They also have JSON data, and this was something, we had a user that was using this. We have in our beta version of DataGraph a way to connect to JSON data, so that what that allows you to do is to never have to you don't have to bring the data in again every time, because the JSON file will, or the JSON object within DataGraph will automatically update every time you open the file or there's a refresh button. And I'll show you that in a moment. But in terms of what that looks like, if let's see, I think I created, oh yeah, there's a link here. So this is a link to what the JSON format looks like. This is very different from the CSV format. So you can see this is very long. Every time there's a new piece of data for a day and a country, they add a new record to this. But again, it's a website that we can link to. So instead of bringing all the data into DataGraph, you're actually linking to the website, and then you'll be able to refresh that data again with doing nothing, basically. Okay, but first, if I just want to look at the CSV file, I think I have downloaded this one as well. Yeah, okay, so here's the file. And this is also in a nice flattened format where we have all of this data. I can go ahead and bring this file in, again, dropping the CSV onto my data. You can see this looks a lot more similar to the World Health Organization data also. There's some more information in here, and the data is also organized with some other parameters being shown in addition to the date, which again, I can just go ahead, right click on that, convert to a date column. Sometimes DataGraph will pick up that it's a date on its own. In this case, it didn't. So again, I can just go ahead and add that in. I have the day, the month, the year. They're showing here cases as well as deaths, country codes. They also have the population of the countries shown, as well as the continent. So that they give you a little bit more information, and some of this is really data that's repeated because it's showing you this categorical information for these countries, but it makes it easier in terms of having this available to you. Okay, so if I wanted to, what I'd like to do is actually show you a graph that I've made with this data that's in the JSON format, for those of you who might be interested in that. This is in our beta version of DataGraph, but we've tested this. It seems to be working. We're hoping to have this in the release version very soon. If you are a beta user, then this is available to you. If you're not a beta user, The beta is available for anyone who has a license to DataGraph. They tend to be pretty stable because we do testing, before we release the betas. But there is the chance that things may change slightly in the beta. So just to be aware of it. But all the functionality and getting the latest updates of DataGraph are in that version. And it's easy to switch back to the release version if at any time you want to go back to the release. You don't have to, if you use the beta at one time, you don't have to commit to it. You can re-download the release version. In any case, what you see here on the left-hand side is the icon for the JSON object. And you create these using the other drop-down menu. You would click JSON group from link, and that creates this group. I undo that. I didn't necessarily mean to place that within the, see, this is, I guess this is showing me the beta. Let me see if I can get this. I sort of messed up my JSON object. There we go. So it seemed to break that link on me. Let me bring my file back. And when you set these up, maybe I'll just show you how to set this up from scratch. So I have this link to the HTTP site. And let me not place this in this group, but go ahead and place this in a new JSON group. And then we have, here's where we would type in the URL associated with that JSON data. And what it does is it goes online and it checks that website to see what columns are available within that data set. So it automatically populated this list of columns. And if I want to, that doesn't actually place any data within DataGraph. Let me actually hide the one that I have already created. But for this new one, if I want then all of the columns that you see within this object to be connected to my DataGraph file, I can use the gear menu and say create missing columns. We'll give it a moment. And now all that data that's within that JSON object is updated. Okay, so we have one question. Can we plot things other than bar graphs using the pivot function? So the pivot functionality currently does only plot bar graphs. But let me show you how I use that to then do other types of graphs. First, let me see if I can just reconnect for you the graphs that you see here. So basically, what I did was I placed my JSON object within another JSON object, and that disconnected my my columns that you see here. I'm going to delete these columns and see if I can't just get this to reconnect for me. And I think, oh, I see. The problem is, this is one of the things that this is, debugging within DataGraph. When you see a red dot somewhere, it means that there's an error code that's coming to this particular global variable. And this is something I have set up to pull the last day of data from one of my columns. And when I disconnected that object, it gave me this error here. So I can change this back again to select the column, and then this is going to pull that value. And the same thing here. If I'm selecting the number of cases, and I believe, actually, I think I picked the wrong one. This would be from the different group and cases. Okay, so I fixed my global variables. There's no longer red dots there. I don't want to mess with this too much if I need to double check this functionality, but you can see if I grab and drop that there, if that resets. No, it's something that is missing that I think I must be calculating in this one. I'll try one more time. No, sorry about that. Okay. I don't know if I just undo. There we go. Okay. So when in doubt, one of the things I've been teaching people is you do something that doesn't work, then Command Z is the way to undo, and DataGraph has unlimited undo to the last time you saved. So we've got back the graphs that we were seeing here. And the question was, what other graph types can we, or does the pivot command do anything other than a bar graph? And the pivoting, at this point, it does only do bar graphs. We have another command that we've been working on that would be a pivoting with plotting. But the way DataGraph works is that we don't just, we use commands not only for processing the data, but we can use them then for pulling the data back out into the data table and using it in other commands by this, what we refer to as a data flow paradigm. So you can think of each of these pivot commands as being a way to process the data. But if I want to then use my data in another command, I can take that processed data, bring it back into the data table, and use that in other types of graphics. So as you see here, here's my pivot command where I'm taking this data on the total number of deaths and I'm calculating the sum over each week. If I wanted to use a line graph for this, I can take the data here, that this is just a preview of how the data is being pivoted. I can click on the gear menu and say that I want to extract all pivot columns. And when I do that, I get now two columns that have been brought back into my data table that are linked to this, again, original data set, this data that I've downloaded or that I'm connected to via this JSON object. Then I could take this data and I could create a new graph and I could do a plot using that data and do some formatting on that column of data. I could do the same thing for, actually, I think I was in this file. I can extract from any of these pivot commands that I have, extract all the pivot columns. Now I have, actually, I guess this was from the different, my different graphs. I can highlight this and I can see which pivot command I'm using here to get this different data. But in any case, now I have these data in my table and I could then plot this data. So now I have these two different data sets that I've extracted back into my data table. I'm using these for my lines command. And again, it's all connected. So once you create it once, you don't need to create it again. For this file, because it's using this JSON object, every time I now open this file, it will update and bring in all the most recent data that's been published on COVID. And I can add more formatting to this. But again, this gives you the ability to use this in other types of commands. And we're getting close to an hour, so I want to open up for other questions that people may have. Really, we haven't, I guess, done too much in terms of different types of graphing, just more talked about the different data sets, how we get them into DataGraph, some basics of how we would graph this data. One of the things that I can show you is a file that I did using some of this World Health Organization data and also some data from the World Bank, where if we have the pivot commands, we can also use this ranking. And then here what I did is I turned them on their side so that you could see we can see the countries on the left-hand side, and now this is ranked according to the values that are the most. And again, this is all linked to, or the countries that have the highest number of cases. This is all linked to the original data. So if I drag and drop my new data set, this is all going to update. Yeah, the JSON data sets do currently work only in the beta version. Was one of the questions, is that the case? And that is true right now. The JSON is just in the beta version. You can actually run both the beta and the release version on your computer. I wouldn't recommend trying to run them at the same time, but you could download the beta. And as long as the release version is already loaded onto your computer, you would be able to run the beta without any additional registration. You can just download the file and open it up, and you'd be able to run the beta and could use these files. One of the other things I did want to talk about is animating the data. So if you go to the online examples, there is one data set that I've posted where this is a more complicated file. It uses a global variable in order to create an animation of the data. So if I go into this file, let me go ahead, and some of you may have already seen this, but if I use this animation variable down in the bottom left, this variable currently has a range of 0 to 1.15, and basically it's 0 to 1 in terms of changing the date range I'm interested in, and I added a little padding to the end so that it would stop at the end and stay on my last date. So what's happening here is I have deaths per day plotted versus new cases per day, and every point on the graph is a different country, and you can see how these different countries move around, and I have the date showing in the background. And to show you a couple of things here in terms of how am I getting this to work, you'll notice that as I change this animation slider, which if you use the animation slider, you can also put the date range itself into the range that you see here. I tend to prefer at this point to tie keep my animation slider very simple, just from 0 to 1, or maybe a little bit of padding beyond that. And then I use an expression variable, as you see here, in order to define what my starting and ending time is. So I have a variable that's my start date of my animation. I have a variable that's my end date, where the end is actually being pulled from the column that defines my data set. And these variables are used in other variables, and specifically you can see the expression here, where it is then calculating the time. Now, dates are, when you look at dates, you see them as, like, for example, you see here, you see a day, you see the month, and you see the year, but underlying every date is a number. If you're not familiar with this, there's a standard where the date value itself is actually the number of seconds since 1970. This is a standard that's used in a lot of different programs. And that's why when you see the time here, you're not seeing the date in a formatted way, but you're actually seeing the raw number. This is the number of seconds for that particular day since 1970. And you can see that it changes along here. And this time variable, if you go to the gear menu, you can look at what variables it's using by go to the suppliers, or go to the clients to see everywhere that this time variable is being used. It's being used in a lot of different places. If you look down here, this is showing me that it's being used in text labels, for example, in some of these different graphs. That's how I have the time changing. But it's also used in these other columns in order to create to pick, not to pick, but to interpolate the value that's being plotted on these graphs. So if I did an animation of this and I just used the raw data as it was provided by these different data sources, it would be very jumpy. You would see different points from different days jump from one to the next to the next. But that's not what you see when I play this animation. What you see is a relatively smooth movement of each of these data points. The way that this is achieved is by using what we refer to as an interpolate by category program, interpolate by category column. What this column allows you to do is to specify an input data set where you have a numeric variable that defines the your x-axis that you would interpolate over, and then you would have you then have another variable where you're specifying what value do you want output from this column. And if I go into, let's see, if I look at the groups here, this first group is the downloaded CSV file from the European Data Organization. My group that I see here, this is the data at time equal to t. This is my interpolated value. So this first group, actually, let me just look at this really quickly. This shows me 11,000 rows of data. If I go to my data at time equal to t, this is very different because this is showing me I created a column that has one row for every country and also shows me the region within that country. I have my labels that I'm using on my graph. And then these two columns are what I'm interpolating the value for. If I'm playing my animation, these numbers are actually being calculated as my animation is being run. And these are the numbers that I'm actually plotting on the graph itself. So if I go to this column to see how is this done, then let's see. Oh, this is actually, there's two levels here to get this to work correctly. And I've done my best to try and explain what each of these does. But if you go to the map cases column, this is where I have the interpolation being done. So the first part of this is telling me what country is this, what the data I'm using, the larger set of data that I've downloaded. If you click on this, you see this is coming from the downloaded CSV. This is using cases. And then I want to output at the countries with this country code, this label here, at the time variable that I've created down below here. So I know it's a little, if you haven't seen this before, it might be a little complicated. It's good to maybe try and create some of these from scratch yourself, just to see how this interpolation works and how it fits together. There's a long, what I hopefully is a pretty good description online as to how that interpolation by category works. So if you create one of these columns, for example, I create an interpolation by category column, you can go to the gear menu, click on help, and that will bring you to the help page for that particular category and kind of walks through a simpler example as to how the interpolation works. Okay, we're just at 12 o'clock. And I'm happy to spend a couple more minutes if anyone has any questions. Thank you. There's some positive input that this looked impressive and helpful, so that I appreciate that. We didn't do too much on plotting lines, but that, again, if you get used to extracting the data from the pivot commands and that data flow concept, it really is nice because, again, everything stays updated with the original data set. Oh, and actually, one of the things I really wanted to show you that from this data, because this data is already in a pretty nice format. This is the CSV that I downloaded from online, where all I did was drag and drop that CSV into this file and cancel. I dragged a row again, did not mean to do that. I believe if I go to my data processing README in this, yeah, here you see, again, I put an HTML link to show you where this data came from. This is the ECDC data, which I believe I've already downloaded. I believe it's, actually, let me just download it again to make sure that I get the correct data. Download the CSV. So even though this file is not directly connected to the website using the JSON format, because I kept my input data completely separate from my processed version of the data, all I need to do to update this is download the CSV. Here's my file. Assuming that I've got the right thing here. I think this is the whole, just want to make sure I've downloaded the whole thing. It looks okay. So let me go ahead and see if this will work. So I'm going to take this. I took the CSV file, I dragged it, and I'm literally dropping it on the group where I imported this data previously. And that maybe happened so quickly, it's maybe even hard to see. But if you notice, now my end date shows up as the 15th. Let me see if I can just do a Command Z to undo that so you can see the difference. So this is the data as it's currently on our online help system is April 17th. If I redo the drag and drop, so I'm just going to do Shift Command Z to redo that. Now the end date is automatically updated to the last day of the data that was imported, and all the data is now also in here. So I went from having 11,000 rows to 17,000 rows, and all I did again was drop the file onto this group, and it will automatically update all your data. Now that's predicated on the fact that I have I'm importing the same exact file as I did before. I have the same exact column headers. I haven't changed any of the names. If you do change the names or you add other columns into the same group, DataGraph will ask you likely to confirm where you want that data to go. So you can do it, but it just might require another step. So it is very handy to try when you're using these external data sets to drag it and drop it into a column and to have that raw data kept separate from where you do other data processing. So now here, again, it automatically updated so I can see how this data has changed as of May 15th. Okay, so again, happy to answer any questions. It doesn't look like anyone has any at this time. Again, this file has a lot of information in here as to how this works. We've even added in an ability to change the playback speed of this so that you can change how, if you change the slope using these global variables, it will change how fast or slow the animation runs during different times within the animation. So you can have the beginning part run faster than the end part. So yeah, there's a lot in this file, but hopefully this helps you and gives you some understanding of these data sets. And if there's other things that you would like to see, and possibly more of an emphasis on how you do the animations and use the data and other types of commands, that's something we could do in a future webinar. For now, I'll go ahead and sign off, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thanks so much for attending.